introduction, that isn't the main driver of privatisation. The main driver of privatisation is conservative ideology, to be honest. That's the main driver.
Thank you very much. In the last moments of my little speech, I mentioned the fact that the NHS is safe in the hands of UKIP. Louise Bors, who's our health services spokesperson, the MEP, she announced back last September at our party conference that we'd maintain the principles of the NHS, we would not privatise it. Now, you may have read information recently stating that UKIP will privatise sections of the NHS. That is fundamentally wrong. We won't do that. In fact, we would inject about £3 billion into the NHS to improve some of the wanting areas that exist at the present time, and we all know what those are. The other thing I'd like to mention is the NHS was formed back in 1948. It was really not a public health service even then, because the consultants were on private contracts, employment contracts, and most of the GPs still remain on private contracts. The Labour Party introduced PFI, private funding initiatives, under Tony Blair, and perpetuated by Gordon Brown. So in no way can you say it is purely the Conservative Party that wants to privatise the NHS, because the Labour Party has already been doing it. But I can assure you that in UKIP, we will ensure that the principles behind the NHS will remain as they are now, a public sector organisation. Thank you.
Thank you.
The question of value for money, I think, is important in this. And Paul mentioned private finance initiative. Everyone, a lot of people thought at the time, including a number of Lib Dems, a number of people in the Labour Party, that this was a wonderful solution to getting investment in public services. We now know that the cost of it is going to be something we're going to be paying for many, many years to come, and it's actually going to cause some long-term damage to those public services. So we need to be aware of the risks of further privatisation. John mentioned something which was quite appropriate to sum up to the coalition, of which I've been a somewhat uncomfortable supporter, I think it's probably fair to say, about talking about the NHS bill and any qualified provider. Well, the original draft of the NHS bill, the Conservative form, the Andrew Lansley form, was talking about any willing provider, no element of qualification, so you can see there the difference in the emphasis between us and the Conservatives. We would like to see the NHS run on the principle of collaboration, not competition. We want to take the sections on competition out of that Act, which is something we weren't able to persuade the Tories to do. There's more of a role for mutuals, but there's been far too much, as Paul said, cherry-picking of the best services to sell off to private companies, and we're all going to be regretting that for some years to come.
Thank you.
Well, I think I just want to bring it. Right, I'll try again. I think that the Green policy is very clearly. We had a vote at conference about, there was a lot of discussion about repealing the Health and Social Care Act, but actually it sort of became sort of relevant because in terms of the Green Party wanting to promote the reinstatement of the NHS bill, which would actually take us right, I'd say right back to before privatisation began, but I see that very much as a step forward into the kind of security of services that we need to provide for the future. And I guess my discomfort is that there's a lot of talk about safeguarding the NHS within TTIP, and I'm not uncomfortable about that. I think that's great, but I also don't see that in the sort of either leaked documents that have come through. And our Green MEPs are trying to push for very specific clauses to keep the NHS protected or excluded. But my other concern, I guess, is things like education as well. My child's education is to do with benefit for him, for our community. It's not to do with, he's not fodder for profit. And, I watch, because he couldn't get a place at Bradford School, he goes to school in North Yorkshire. And there I just watched the local authority provision just falling to pieces, so that schools becoming academies. And I'm just looking at this thinking, hang on, so this breaking down, then you have TTIP, massive companies come in and goodbye to any sense of my child's education being for him or for the future. It's for the profit of somebody else's company. So we're very much about public funded public services. Thank you very much.
Jeff Lee.
Yeah, that's me. My question is about the notorious ISDS, the Interstate Development Settlements. At the moment in this country, all the political parties are sorting out their programmes, organising their manifestos before the election takes place in May. After then, one party or two or three will be in charge, and the idea is they then put into practice what they promised. They don't usually, or they often don't. However, in a future TTIP-dominated New World Order, in the run-up to any future elections, the parties will have to pay attention to the interests of the multinational corporations and make sure that any policies they propose to carry out when in charge will not affect the profits of the multinational corporations who operate in this country. So my question to the panel is, in future, do they think general elections will be pointless, even farcical?
Oh, you sorry.
You've raised an important question, actually. I've worked with some of the largest companies in the world. As far as Britain is concerned, they're going to have a huge influence over how we operate. But I can tell you, in the European Union, European Commission, what they do is lobby the MEPs. They lay on lavish entertainment and food and drink for the MEPs. There's 750 of them in Brussels. How do I know? Well, I worked for one of the MEPs until recently, and I've had a report back from the MEPs in our party that this is how the EU works and how large multinationals and global companies gain influence. I think that's fundamentally wrong. Why should they have any influence over how government operates? Now, obviously I'm not in favour of the EU and the way it functions, but I do believe that MPs in this country shouldn't be under any influence from large companies and from lobbyists. I think that's wrong for our democracy, and I hope everybody here agrees with me with that. Thank you.
Well, I sit on the committee, I'm elected to the committee that produces the Lib Dem's General Election Manifesto, so I hope the answer to Jeffrey's question is no, and that the interests of people must remain paramount. They certainly should do. There is already a huge deal, and John and others will know this too, of lobbying that goes on by multinational corporations. If you think back to the 1990s on things like GM food, if you look at today, the money being spent by Heathrow and Gatwick on lobbying for airport expansion, again riding roughshod over the interests of residents in and around those areas. On a lower level, I was in the position that Ross was in as a volunteer campaigner around a table with the pub trade two weeks ago as a campaign. The campaign I've been fighting for years to regulate pub companies and try and protect the British pub took place, whilst government took decisions that affect those companies, but affect communities as well. As far as I'm concerned, a company should take the risk of regulations changing. They should not have the ability to override that by going to court. I'm confident that ISDS in its current form, as set out by 38 Degrees and others, is not going to happen, because I cannot see 28 EU member governments doing it. If I had the vote on that, I certainly wouldn't be voting to support those sorts of ISDS measures.
Kim.
I think again the ISDS mechanism is really concerning, and I think there's a UN report in 2013 just calling for change across the board of transparency, and obviously the way it affects different countries as well. Whether you've got the money to fight that case or whether you haven't, that would depend a lot on the outcome. And I think again back to the meeting during the week. The addition of the extra 200 houses was because there was a QC who'd had the time been paid to look into a legal loophole that Bradford Council hadn't followed up properly, local government hadn't followed up properly. He was able to look that up, make sure that happened, and sort of steer the conversation amongst people. I have to trust him as QC. I haven't got the money to challenge that, but that just really bothers me. That again, it's always those with the funds and the resources that can actually bring about change. And that's, I guess, why I'm just so fundamentally against TTIP, and also for reform of ISDS, regardless of TTIP. I think especially of Germany and the nuclear industry. So I'm very much against that.
Okay. John?
Well, in the last decade, big business has got about as bad a reputation as politicians have, if we're honest. And yet, there is a word called corporate social responsibility, and I'd like to live with a government which I'd like a few more big businesses in Keighley, by the way, and the people of Keighley, those without work, could do with a big manufacturer, for example, coming into the area, but I'd like that manufacturer to be paying the living wage, to be paying its taxes properly. And a lot of businesses do, so let's not completely write off the world of business because they provide the jobs and the money that pays for things like the NHS. But when it comes to resolving disputes, and obviously there will be disputes, for me, the same courts of the land that we all go to are the proper place to do that. And, there is a big lobby of opinion in Europe, in Germany and elsewhere, that thinks that should be the case. But yes, companies that have invested a lot in a particular service, they shouldn't have that service expropriated. That clearly they do have legal rights. But they should fight their corner in the same courts that anybody else does, rich or poor, and that principle of equality before the law should be rigorously followed.
Thank you. I think all were nicely inside time that time. Congratulations. Carol.
Hi. I'm greatly concerned that in the rush to cut red tape and to ease trade between Europe and the US, the TTIP agreement will lower or even erase environmental, public health and animal welfare standards. For example, one of the things that may happen is that we have inspectors at our ports when things are brought into this country, and that wouldn't happen. We would have to be trusting that those that were exporting it had followed the requirements. Now, this is because the standards set by the EU are on the whole superior to those for the US. For example, in areas of GM crops, pesticides, chemicals in makeup, and meat treated with growth hormones, or, as I think probably lots of people have heard recently, chickens being washed in disinfectant just because people aren't following the proper health and safety procedures. I know you said about big business, perhaps not all being bad, but while you're saying that the agreement might promote jobs, it's certainly going to promote jobs for big businesses rather than small businesses. Does the panel share my concerns?
Yes, I do, very much. As you might expect. I was really concerned thinking about this, obviously all of those issues, and especially with regard to, I don't need to list the environmental issues that Caroline's raised because that's deeply what I care about, but I was very concerned that this Confederation of Small Businesses is very supportive of TTIP, which I found interesting in terms of obviously everybody wants to take the most opportunity they can to innovate, and I'm certainly supportive of that. I see there's a very big difference between trade and trade agreements. Very supportive of trade, but very wary of very big trade agreements. And I went to see our local butcher and talked to him about it. He said, well, it won't necessarily affect me. He said, because if I tried to sell cheap Argentinian beef, no one would buy it from my shop anyway, where you get it from the Three Dales. And then again, I was talking with somebody else from Global Justice, and she said, but actually, where local authorities may want to source local produce and local standards, there may be times when these clauses are withdrawn where you can't, because it would not be in the interest of global trade. So that was my concern, is that it comes in through the back door sometimes, or even the front door. But thank you.
Thank you.
I think Carol's raised some very relevant concerns about the impact of TTIP. I certainly would like to know the answers to some of those questions. The problem is that because these negotiations are taking place in private, although some have been leaked out in the German press last year, we really don't know what the full impact is going to be of this legislation. How will it affect animal welfare? How will it affect health and safety? The standards, health and safety standards in operation in the US are very different from those in Europe. We know the impact that the gas that's extracted from the shale beds in America has had in the US compared to the strict laws that we've got in the UK and in Europe. How will all this work in practice? What will the Americans negotiate with the EU, and what will the EU negotiate with the Americans? We just don't know. The net benefit is supposed to be £100 million a year, or £100 billion a year in favour of the EU. But in practice, what will that add up to? I really don't know.
Thank you.
So the European Commission has said absolutely explicitly that we support free trade, but not at the price of sacrificing European standards in areas such as food safety, health, social and data protection or cultural diversity. In other words, every single regulation that's changed is going to have to be negotiated, as I say, line by line. And in the end, it's not going to be secret. It is all going to be public. And all the parliaments of Europe will be able to say yay or nay. And if Labour is in government, we will be wanting to ratchet up rather than talk down some of these standards. But also, let's not forget that in some areas, financial regulation in particular, probably standards are higher and more rigorous in the United States than they are here. But as I say, agreement has to be reached. That's the whole purpose of a negotiation. Just one final point, picking up small and big businesses. I run small businesses. I'm involved a little bit in exporting as well. Sometimes regulations, technical regulations, can exclude small businesses. If you have different regulations, technical regulations in the American market to the European market, the big businesses can cope with that. It's the smaller businesses who can't, who haven't got the time or the resources. That's why the Federation of Small Businesses, it's not rocket science, that's why they're in favour of it, because they are trying to increase jobs, they're trying to boost their own companies. So let's not forget that small businesses have an interest here in trade. If you look around this area of Keighley, some of you mentioned manufacturing, there's a proud tradition still of manufacturing. It's mainly small businesses and they're desperate to export.
Positive. Thank you.
On that point, my partner's company secretary of a small business, and I can reel off a list of they provide lighting, in fact, indeed lighting for churches. I can reel off a list of real barriers through regulation that stop that small business from accessing various markets in the UK and EU, let alone the US. But I think this is probably more important, potentially a more dangerous area of TTIP than even the investor-state dispute resolution stuff, because the devil is going to be in the detail. The EU is vitally important, not particularly on the environment, because you can't tackle climate change alone as a nation or more locally. It has to be done on a much wider scale, and without those strong standards for safety and the environment and in other areas such as animal welfare, we are not going to create a better world. This is going to be a very, very challenging place. In the construction industry, EU standards are way higher than those in the States. You'll have all seen the publicity about the Qatar World Cup and some of the scandals going on construction sites there in health and safety. I want workers in construction in this country to be healthy and safe. We cannot have an erosion of this, and I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about these details as we get into the final stages of negotiations.
Thank you. Next question, Steve McCart.
Thank you very much. Mike, coming on now? Right. My concerns about employment, I think, and the effects some standards will have on it. TTIP is going to put in place arrangements very similar to the North American Free Trade Association, which would allow free trade across North America, Mexico and Canada. This has had two important impacts on trade in the region. Firstly, the movement of the manufacture of environmentally dangerous chemicals was moved from the US and Canada into Mexico, where the environmental standards are lower and the protection for the workers is lower. Secondly, there was a simple migration of manufacturing from the US to areas where labour was cheaper. And the net effect of this, far from being an increase in the number of jobs in the USA, was a drop of 1.5 million jobs. What would the members of the panel put in place to avoid such things happening if TTIP's adopted?
I'll give you a short answer this time, because I think I touched on a number of those points in my answer to the last question. There is a real risk that there's going to be some sort of race to the bottom if standards are lower, and we just have to protect that. One of the interesting things, just to make a point about business in general, manufacturing. One of the things I'm proudest that this government has done is starting to be much more long-term than most British governments have been, and to look beyond a 5-year election cycle. And that's why you've started seeing investment in manufacturing going up in areas. But we do that because of the quality and the high standards that we work at. We can't compete with others on cost at the expense of all else. We should be proud of that in the UK. It's starting to be a competitive advantage for us. So it would really be completely silly for us to throw that away.
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Well, I'll just give you two suggestions that we needn't wait for TTIP to do. We could start doing them in a few weeks' time, depending on the electorate. The first one, I think, is that we should move towards a living wage in this country. It is a disgrace that just where we are now here in Keighley, there are many families who work hard, sometimes with two parents in work, and yet they haven't got enough money at the end of the week to feed their kids and heat their homes, and that's an absolute disgrace. And Britain stands out from many of our neighbours in Europe, actually, which have better protections and so on. And so that's the first thing I'd implement. Let's have a living wage that everyone who does a hard day's work gets paid properly for it. And the second thing is we're beginning to see in this country, and I every day I meet someone in this situation knocking on the doors just around here. 0 hours contracts. Whoever thought that was a good idea, really? Whoever thought that was a good idea, that we should marginalise so many people in our nation who, again, wake up in the morning and are not sure whether they're going to be needed at work. So, two things we could do very quickly without going to either the EU or to the United States is a living wage, and let's clamp down on 0 hours contracts.
Yeah, I think just returning to that small business element, that I completely agree with John about the standardisation and support for small businesses. I guess my concern is I'm working for a community interest company, and look, I went again recently to the European Structural Investment Fund presentation, and again you think, oh, great opportunity for business within the Leeds Enterprise Partnership or Economic Partnership. But actually, when it came down to third sector organisations, almost at sort of the bottom of the pile, you have to have a whole range of other partnerships in place, which I'm not sure if you're going to be able to get those partnerships together and those collaborative partnerships together in time before deadlines have to be met. So my concern is that, again, if we don't have these, if we're not making things work for as many small businesses as possible now, what gives us the hope that once even more big players come on board, that it's going to be any better? And that's from somebody. I'm passionate about being involved, getting children and young people involved in suggesting their own solutions in community work. People are the best people for knowing the solution or for sharing and developing the solutions to their own problems. And so we're going to need to get more money into local community groups to innovate their own solutions. And I'm also just glad that somebody mentioned about NAFTA, and also we need to be aware of CETA, the Canadian-European Trade Agreement, because ISDS provisions can be pursued by American companies through that agreement. But also, not all estates in America are open. Some can be very anti-trade union movements, so there may not be the same level of access into markets there or same standards. Thank you. I only did it once, it's the first time I've done it.
Yes, you're all true.
Returning to Steve's question, there are two parts to it. One part concerns employment, and the second part concerns safety standards and the impact of perhaps free trade. I work as the regional organiser for my party in West Yorkshire on a strictly voluntary basis. The common thread that joins all our candidates together is employment, or to be specific, unemployment. The north of England is the correlation of London and the south east. Very little has been done by any government at all to revitalise the north of England in the last 30 or 40 years. My pet hobby horse is that I want to see a proper department set up in government by the new government to help revitalise the economy of the north. Now, what impact TTIP will have on our regions in the north of England, I really don't know. I don't think anybody has really anticipated that at the moment. But I do believe that we have to have inward investment in the north of England to create jobs, to encourage businesses, not just small ones, but big investors, to set up plants across the north. When it comes to safety standards and free trade, I think the two go together. You can't possibly have a free trade agreement with any nation if the safety standards aren't in place and the population is put at risk because dangerous chemicals are suddenly being made in the country. There are many examples of not having legislation in place around the world. But I think it's important that we still aim for free trade, but at the same time we ensure that the health and safety standards are maintained and improved in those countries that don't have any tariffs. Thank you.
Thank you. We come to our fifth prepared question, I'm going to ask the panellists to be very disciplined in their answers to this one, so we do have a break at roughly half time. Georgina.
Thank you. My question is about democracy. It has been said that one of the problems with TTIP is that it is undemocratic, and there are at least 3 reasons for this view. Firstly, that TTIP is being negotiated behind closed doors in secret. Secondly, it allows foreign businesses to sue states if decisions taken by state governments in the interest of their populations are deemed by businesses to affect their profits. One current example is whereby the German government is being sued by a Swedish energy company because it has taken a decision to phase out nuclear power stations following the Fukushima disaster, so wanting to protect the health of their populations. But the energy company is suing them because of this affecting their profits. The third reason it's deemed to be undemocratic is that the proposed regulatory council would take power away from nationally elected governments. What is your view about the effects of TTIP on democracy? So thinking specifically of democracy.
I think back in October, November time, I don't know if any of you tried to access the European Commission site protesting against ISDS mechanisms, and so many people, I remember trying to get the incredible form that they had to work your way through to try and understand what you even had to fill in to complain about ISDS. Because I was really concerned, as you say, that we've got courts, European courts, but these would be acting by 3 people, and lawyers who can swap